Welcome to the second virtual program of the Foundation's Arts and Humanities Fall Series. We hope that you will enjoy Dr. Kramer's American Travelers in the Old World lecture tonight. At the conclusion of his lecture, there will be an opportunity to ask questions through the chat feature in the YouTube channel that you're looking at. There's an explanation on how to sign in there and create an account. Tonight is an especially important night because it's our annual William S. Bretman Lecture. Bill Bretman retired as rector of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in 1999 and embarked on a collaboration with Jack Cannon to create an arts and humanities program for the foundation. He offered classes on the Greek classics, American history, religious topics, and brought a variety of scholars to our campus. It is a wonderful coincidence tonight that Dr. Lloyd Kramer was one of his first lecturers that Bill invited here in 1999. To introduce Dr. Kramer, Joanna Serg Smith is the Associate Director for State Outreach for the Carolina Public Humanities Program. She and Dr. Kramer are wonderful supporters of our Arts and Humanities program, and we know you're going to enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that warm welcome. And it is my absolute pleasure this evening to join her in welcoming you to this year's William S. Bretman Lecture. And first off, I want to extend an enormous thank you to the Foundation, both for hosting this lecture and for all that they do as champions of the public humanities. I feel confident speaking for Carolina Public Humanities when I say we deeply value our relationship that we have built over the years with our friends here at Wayne Community College. And it's a wonderful feeling to be collaborating with a community that feels like kindred spirits, that shares our belief in the transformative power of the humanities, in our support for public education, and our enthusiasm about learning that goes well beyond the limits of the classroom. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all tonight. I also want to say thank you to Adrienne Northington, to Charlotte Brow, to Diane Belmont, and to Emily Bird for all of the work they put into setting up tonight's lecture and to being so welcoming. And last of all, I want to thank Bill Bretman, in whose honor we are here tonight. So as Charlotte said, tonight we will be hearing a lecture from Dr. Lloyd Kramer. Dr. Kramer is a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill, as well as the director of Carolina Public Humanities. He received his PhD at Cornell University, and in recent years, he's served both as the chair of the history department and as the chair of faculty at UNC. And on top of all of that wonderful service work, he has continued to conduct rigorous research, to teach, and to publish, with most of his work focusing on European history, with a particular attention to modern France and the Atlantic world. Tonight, Dr. Kramer will be presenting a talk titled American Travelers and the Old World, the Literary Journeys and Humor of Mark Twain and David Sedaris. This presentation will examine how these two traveler writers described their encounters with Europe, defined their American identities, and used humor to convey the complexities and miscommunications of cross-cultural experiences. And I have to say, this talk feels very poignantly timed. Even though we are all stuck in a bit of limbo right now under some degree of quarantine, it's valuable to be able to pause together and to consider the value that travel brings and the role that it plays in shaping our identities. So I want to remind you all that you can submit questions through the chat feature even as the lecture is going on, and we'll gather those questions together and bring them to Dr. Kramer for discussion after the lecture. Now I hope you'll all join me in offering a warm welcome from wherever you are to Dr. Lloyd Kramer.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna, and welcome to all of you. I'm so honored to be here, and there are a few dear friends in the auditorium with me, so I feel surrounded by the Goldsboro community. I see my friend Phil Bedour is here, and I've said to him in the past, I've never had a bad day in Goldsboro. I don't get here that often, but I always have a good time when I'm here, and we at Carolina Public Humanities deeply appreciate our partnership. I put up here a picture of the old well at UNC on one side and of Wayne Community College on the other. And this is in honor of Bill Bretman, because as Charlotte noted, my very first trip to Wayne Community College was facilitated by Bill Bretman, who invited me to come here. He's invited me to other events here. We built a community of people who care about public education, and I deeply appreciate all that Bill Bretman does. I call him a humanist and a humanities bridge builder, because that's truly what he is. He builds bridges between people who care about ideas and people who want to discuss history and literature, art and philosophy. And I also want to express my appreciation for Charles Norwood. His wife Nancy is with us this evening, and Charles was a dear friend of mine who I appreciate over the last few years, all that he has done to facilitate the links between the Wayne Community College community and the wider community of Goldsboro and UNC Chapel Hill and Carolina Public Humanities. So I am, in a sense, honoring Bill Bretman and Charles Norwood tonight, and it's my pleasure to talk about travel. I'm going to focus on the period of the 19th century, but also talk some at the end about the 20th century, because travel is one of those aspects of life that has been important in helping people define who they are, their identity, but also giving people a certain kind of social status, because people think of themselves as travelers, and it gives them a certain role in their communities when they come home. And my purpose tonight is to think about how travel has helped to create literary identities, but also personal identities. And I'm going to focus on the examples of Mark Twain and David Sedaris, two very different writers, but also, as I want to argue, two writers whose lives and themes connect in a lot of interesting ways. I've started by putting up here a picture of Notre Dame in Paris, because I want to remind those of you who are watching what a pleasure it is to travel. What a pleasure it is to see beautiful buildings and go to places like Notre Dame, which has also been seriously damaged by a fire. But someday we'll go back. We'll always have Paris, as they say in Casablanca, the great film. And in some sense, this is a testimony to the power and memory of travel. And maybe in this time, number one, when we can't travel, and number two, when our lives seem to be obsessed with politics and conflicts and pandemics, to remember there's more to life than the struggles we're facing right now. So I'm going to talk about Mark Twain and the contemporary writer David Sedaris, and I'm going to talk about how travel and humor came to be connected through writing. I want to make a general point about their writing, Twain and Sedaris, by suggesting that travel experiences offer a way to explore that gap between expectations and reality, the gap between what we think something might be and what it actually is. This is the gap where irony emerges, where satire emerges, where humor emerges, because humor is always about some little gap between what we think something is and what it actually is. And in a way, travel has often been a vehicle for exploring humor, or let's say the gap between expectations and reality. So let me set this up with just a little more about these two writers. They lived in very different periods, of course. This is Mark Twain in a cartoon, showing him as a kind of public speaker, which he was, and a very popular one. And on the other side, the modern writer David Sedaris. Twain was born in 1835. David Sedaris was born in 1956, so clearly they're very different generations. But they both became exceptionally popular travel writers who used humor to make serious points. And this is another one of my themes. I think humor is a way to make important, serious points about society or about identities. They were both physically about the same size. I shouldn't use the past tense for David Sedaris, he's still living, but somewhere around 5'6" or 5'8", somewhere around 145 pounds. They're sort of very similar physical beings. They both lost siblings to early deaths. They both used their fame as humorous writers to go on the lecture circuit. And they both wrote about cultural differences and about cultural identities to define their own identities as writers. So what I want to stress is I find both of these writers interesting because they show how the search for selfhood, the search to understand the self, can be expanded through travel. Because no matter how far we go away from where we came, we find some part of ourself by going to that new place. So great journeys are really a great journey into the self, a great journey of self-exploration. And I think both Mark Twain and David Sedaris explain this and show this, but they explain it with humor. And I'm going to try to illustrate this by quoting some from their text, because as a good humanist, I always believe that texts are the pathway to knowledge. Images help too, but texts are very important. So let me just say a couple of things about the meaning of travel as a category of experience. I've suggested here that the way travel narratives work is that they give you this journey toward self-knowledge. And one of the writers, this by the way is Mark Twain, I should mention this. He's on, let's see, it's probably your right. If you look at the screen, he's wearing a hat on, he's standing up in Constantinople in 1867. Mark Twain, like you've probably never seen him. It's upon his great journey to the Middle East. But one of the people who's tried to explain what writing and travel are all about is a writer named Alain de Botton, who is originally from England, although his family, I think, may be from Switzerland. He wrote a book called The Art of Travel in 2002. And in this book, he talks about his own travels. He's traveled from England to the Caribbean islands, to the Netherlands and Amsterdam. He's traveled to Israel, to France, to Spain. He's traveled to many different countries around the world. And he's also discussed writers who wrote about travel. People like the French writers Gustave Flaubert or Baudelaire, or the English writers Wordsworth or Ruskin, or the Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh. And he's used these writers to meditate on the meaning of the travel experience, how we learn about ourselves through travel. This is an image of Botton on the cover of his book, a very interesting book. If you're interested in travel, I recommend this book as an exploration of the travel experience. And I have a kind of long quote here, but I want to share it because I think it sets up the overall theme that I want to stress. Botton says, if our lives are dominated by a search for happiness, then perhaps few activities reveal as much about the dynamics of this quest as our travels. They express an understanding of what life might be about outside of the constraints of work and of the struggle for survival. Journeys are the midwives of thought. Few places are more conducive to internal conversations than moving planes or ships or trains. At the end of hours of train dreaming, we may feel we have been returned to ourselves, that is, brought back into contact with emotions and ideas of importance to us. It is not necessarily at home that we best encounter our true selves. What then is a traveling mindset? Receptivity might be said to be its chief characteristic. Receptive, we approach new places with humility. We carry with us no rigid ideas about what is or is not interesting. Home, by contrast, finds us more settled in our expectations. And I think Botton's description of this experience is a wonderful summary of how leaving home changes the way you understand home, how you see things you can never see in your own place. So Botton is a kind of theoretical guide for the talk we're going to pursue here this evening. So let me now jump back to the 19th century, because the experience of travel became very important for Americans during the 19th century. There were hundreds, even thousands of books written about travel by Americans. During the 19th century, the number of travelers from America rapidly expanded. Around 1815, something like 5,000 Americans went to Europe each year. By the 1850s, there were about 30,000 going every year. And then after 1865, there were even more. There were thousands and thousands of travelers going and staying for many years in some cases. I should note that men made the trip more often than women, but by mid-century, there were many women going to Europe as well, and there were many writers. And most Americans remained very deferential to European culture. They went there to learn about art or about great architecture. And then they would write letters home, and these letters were often collected into books, and these are the sources of these books. These were very serious books in most cases, people talking about how they had visited museums or how they had seen some great cathedral. I put on this screen, there's a book here by a man named Harold Smith, who's actually looked up all of these books. I never would do this myself, but he has found over 1,800 books. And they were written by all kinds of people: clergymen, artists, businessmen, diplomats, educators, journalists. There were missionaries, there were physicians, sailors, soldiers, all of these people traveling to Europe and writing about the experience. And before Mark Twain, most of these writers were very serious. They would explain how they had a kind of experience in seeing great art, or how they had had a religious experience. Many of them were pious. They talked about visiting churches. But even the most secular books were fairly serious. So I want to give you just a couple of examples of the pre-Twain experience of writing, the pre-Twain writers. And I want to mention two people. One, a woman named Margaret Fuller, who lived from 1810 to 1850. This is a picture of Margaret Fuller. And the other is an enslaved African American named David Dorr, a very rare example of an enslaved man who went to Europe with a person who was his, quote, master, and then he wrote a book about it later. So we have a woman writer and an enslaved African American. These are not typical writers, but they give you an idea of how people used writing to affirm selfhood. Margaret Fuller was originally from Massachusetts. She received a classical education. Her father, Timothy Fuller, was actually a congressman from Massachusetts, but she could not attend the university because she was a woman. So she was forced to get her education in other ways, but she wanted to become a writer. She did become a good friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson. She ended up in New York, and she became a writer for the New York Daily Tribune. Horace Greeley was the editor. And Greeley agreed to send her to Europe to write articles about Europe. There hadn't been European correspondence up until this time, but she was one of the very first. And so in 1846, she went to Europe, and she lived there for 4 years. She lived through the revolutions of 1848. She wrote almost 40 different articles, sent them back to the Tribune, and then later these were collected in a book called Home and Abroad, or Things and Thoughts in America and Europe. Tragically, in 1850, as she was returning to America with her Italian husband and her infant son, she was in a shipwreck off the coast of Fire Island in New York, just very close to the coast, in a storm, and she died at age 40. But I want to use Fuller as an example of how a woman could use writing to define an independent identity. This is an example of someone claiming the right to discuss art, even though women were not supposed to write about such subjects. This is from an article in the New York Tribune in March of 1847. Always art is art, only by presenting an adequate outward symbol of some fact in the interior life. A great work of art demands a great thought or a thought of beauty adequately expressed. This seems to be the case with Turner. He has become awake to what is essential in nature. She was writing about a controversial English painter named William Turner, who was, in some ways, this image is one of the first sort of non-representational works of art. But here she was claiming the right to write about art. And I use her as an example because you're going to see Twain writes about art too, but in a very different way. She is claiming the right to explain culture. The other pre-Twain author I want to mention is this man David Dorr, who's probably much less well known than Margaret Fuller. He lived from 1827 to 1872. He was originally from New Orleans, and he traveled to Europe with a man named Cornelius Fellows, who was a businessman, a white businessman in New Orleans, and he took Dorr with him. Dorr was a very light-skinned, young African-American man, and it may be that that Fellows was actually his father. You know, this was not uncommon. In any case, he took Dorr with him, and when he came back, Dorr demanded his freedom. Fellows refused to give it to him. Dorr ran away to Ohio, and he lived in Cleveland. He later joined the Union Army, and he wrote this book in 1858 called A Colored Man Around the World. And his writing style is less serious than Fuller's, but it also shows how one could affirm a new identity through writing, travel, literature. And he especially talked about the importance of Africa, and this was very important to him. And here's a quote. He went to Egypt, where Twain also went, as we'll see in a minute. And he claimed that the Egyptian pyramids and the culture of Egypt showed the greatness of African culture, the importance of the African achievements. What genius, this is what he wrote about the Egyptian pyramids, what genius must have reflected on their foundations. What an ambition these people must have given to the rest of the world. Well, who were the Egyptians? Egypt was a higher sphere of science than any other nation on the earth. This will naturally convey an idea that the black man was the first skillful animal on the earth, because Homer, the Greek poet, Homer describes the Egyptians as men with woolly hair, thick lips, flat feet, and black, and we have no better authority than Homer. You see, David Dorr is also claiming from his travel that Africa is a great cultural community, that Africa is a place to be recognized. So both Fuller and Dorr wrote books to construct an identity for themselves, an identity of freedom and achievement that was impossible at home. And this leads me now to Mark Twain. This is an image of the young Mark Twain when he was about 20 years old. So Mark Twain, one of the greatest of all travel writers, was born in 1835. He lived until 1910, 75 years. He often said he came in with Halley's Comet and he went out with Halley's Comet, which was true. He went out the same year Halley's Comet came back in 1910. And he became a travel writer with a new kind of voice. Not a voice like David Dorr or Margaret Fuller, as important as those voices were. He had a different kind of voice. And I want to argue that he constructed his identity as a writer through travel. I'm sure many of you know the story of Mark Twain. He was born in Florida, Missouri, small town. His father was a struggling lawyer and shop owner. His father, John Clemens, was not very religious, but his mother, Jane Clemens, was a very devout Presbyterian. And when the family moved when Sam Clemens, his name was Samuel Clemens, when he was young, they moved to Hannibal, Missouri, which is mostly where he grew up. Sam had 2 sisters and 3 brothers, and one of the great traumas of his youth was that one of his sisters died when she was 9 years old. He was only 3. And then he lost a brother when his brother died when his brother was 10, and Sam was only 6. And then when Sam was 11, his father died. So by the time he was 11, his sister had died, his brother had died, his father had died. And I mention this because he, throughout his life, had a certain guilt about this, for whatever psychological reasons, that somehow he was responsible for his siblings' early demise. This is the house where he lived in Hannibal. This is a picture of him late in life. He went back to visit in Hannibal, Missouri. When he was a young man, a young student, he hardly ever went to school, but he went for a few years. He attended church regularly with his mother. He apparently was very good at spelling, but he never got much formal education except that he read the Bible a lot. But he became very restless, and he got a job with his brother. His brother was a printer, a publisher of a small newspaper, and by the time he was 15 or 16, he was working with his brother Orion, O-R-I-O-N, Orion Clemens, on this newspaper. And then in 1853, when he was only 17 years old, he was a restless young man. He left Missouri, he went to New York. He went to Philadelphia. He was fascinated by Benjamin Franklin, who was also a printer and a writer and a traveler. And he began writing letters back to his brother's newspaper about what he saw in the East. So from an early age, he was traveling. He was always restless. You know, one of the ways we might describe American identity is restlessness. Americans have always been on the move, going somewhere else, not staying in the town where they grew up. So he was on the move. He traveled east, he came back, he traveled again, and he decided he was going to go to the Amazon in Brazil and make his fortune. This was the other way in which he was a typical American. He always thought he was going to strike it rich, but he never quite got that done. But then he was traveling on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and he met a pilot there named Horace Bixby. And this river pilot said, you know, you like to travel. You ought to think about being a river pilot. And Sam said, you know, that's a good idea. So he began learning how to pilot riverboats, and this is what he did. He became a riverboat pilot. He also talked his younger brother Henry into joining him on the riverboats. And another tragedy, his brother Henry was working on a boat. Sam was going to go on the boat with him. He got in a fight with the pilot. He left the boat. The next night, the boat engine room blew up, and his brother Henry was killed in a boat accident. Another death of a sibling. This had a traumatic effect on Sam. He felt responsible because he had brought his brother onto that boat. But he kept with this. He became a river pilot, and by 1859, he had a licensed pilot certificate, and he worked on 18 different steamboats in the period between 1859 and 1861, up and down that Mississippi River, even after the death of his brother. But then in 1861, as we know, the Civil War came along. He was in New Orleans at the time. He decided to go back up north. He went to Missouri. Some of his friends talked him into joining the Confederate militia in Missouri. He said he'd lasted 2 weeks. He hated it. He ran away immediately. He wanted nothing to do with that militia. And he went with his brother Orion out to Nevada. This is an image of Virginia City, Nevada, which is where he went with his brother, who got a job as an assistant to the governor of the Nevada Territory. And there he started working for a local newspaper, the Virginia City newspaper. And this was his first real newspaper job. And he started writing stories, and gradually he took on a name called Mark Twain. This is where he became Mark Twain. He got the name, it's a term on the Mississippi River. Mark Twain means you've just passed a point that's 2 fathoms deep, in other words, 12 feet deep. It could mean either that you're heading into dangerous waters or you're coming out of dangerous waters. And he loved that term because it had a kind of ambiguous status, Mark Twain. In any case, he had a knack for writing humorous stories, and he moved on to San Francisco. And he began writing stories about mining camps and about communities in the West, and he wrote a very famous story called The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, about a competition with a man who has a frog who jumps, and people bet on the frog, It was hilarious. One of the funniest stories ever written, at least one of the funniest stories in the 1860s. And this story began to make his reputation as a writer of humorous stories. He then worked for a while in San Francisco. This is an image of San Francisco in the 1860s. He then got a job working for the Sacramento Union, and he went off to Hawaii and wrote a series of travel letters about Hawaii, which was then called the Sandwich Islands. So the point I want to make is that Mark Twain lived through the Civil War from the safety of San Francisco. He never got involved in the Civil War, and although he's one of the quintessential American writers, he managed to miss the Civil War. So after this trip to Hawaii, he then went back to San Francisco. He began doing work as a public speaker. He had a knack for giving great lectures, funny lectures. And he started this in San Francisco in 1866. He gave, over the next 30 years, over 1,000 talks. This is a sort of a cartoon showing him in a public sphere, standing on a stage. He traveled all over the world in later years, giving talks, including Australia, Europe, New Zealand, India, South Africa. Wherever he went, he had a great knack of telling funny stories. He developed this already in the 1860s. But in 1867, he moved on to New York. Huge move, all the way from the West back east, after writing these travel stories about Hawaii, telling humorous stories about mining camps. And he heard about this trip, a trip on a boat called the Quaker City that was being organized by a Brooklyn pastor called Harry Ward Beecher. And to go on this trip, you had to pay $1,250. This was an amazing ship. It had been built in 1854, been used as a Union transport boat during the Civil War, and now it was a tourist ship. And this was going to be the first steamboat tour of the Old World. And I think Twain saw this as a great opportunity. He convinced a newspaper, the San Francisco Alta, to buy him a ticket. He signed up, and the agreement was he would write articles about this trip. Here he is. You can see him on the deck of the ship in this little red square, surrounded by the other passengers. There were about 70 passengers, including 17 women, and there was also a young man named Charles Jervis Landon, whose sister, Olivia, would later become Twain's wife. So this is a very productive trip. He got his first book out of the trip, and he met the brother of the man who would introduce the brother of the woman who he would marry. A very successful trip. In any case, here he is aboard the ship, and out of this trip, he would write letters. It was a trip you can see on this map. He went in here, past Gibraltar, up to Marseille, up to Paris, around Italy, all the way over to Greece, and then around the Middle East, and then eventually back to the United States. It was a trip that lasted about, I think it was about 5 months, from June of 1867 to November of 1867. And he wrote a book about this called Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress. It became a best-selling book. It sold over 70,000 copies, and it was altogether different from the other travel books that people had been publishing. And I want to argue that this book made Mark Twain. There were kind of three elements to this book that defined his new literary identity. First, it showed that he could be a serious writer because he commented on serious issues, but always with humor. He was a brilliant, funny writer. If you've never read Innocents Abroad, I recommend it. You'll find yourself laughing out loud. I've often used these in classes with students at Carolina, and the students, they don't always laugh out loud, but sometimes they do, and it's pretty amazing if a joke from 1867 is still funny in 2019. That's a real joke. Secondly, he showed how America differed from Europe. He affirmed an American identity. Instead of deferring to the culture of Europe, he asserted the innovation and creativity of America. And finally, he used travel to reflect on the themes that he never could quite let go of: the meaning of time, the problem of death, and the experience of loss. And remember, he had lost his father and 3 of his siblings. He was intimately aware of the pain and grief of losing loved ones. So, how does he do this? I'm going to give you a few quotes. By the way, the book is long. It's like over 600 pages, so I'm going to save you a little time. I'm going to give you some excerpts, a few. First of all, Twain establishes his identity as someone who is different from other writers. This is what he says in the preface. This book is a record of a pleasure trip. If it were a record of a solemn scientific expedition, it would have it about it that gravity, that profundity, that impressive incomprehensibility, which are so proper to works of that kind and withal so attractive. Yet it has a purpose, which is to suggest to the reader how he would be likely to see Europe and the East if he looked at them with his own eyes instead of the eyes of those who traveled in those countries before him. See, I'm going to bring you a fresh view. I offer no apologies for any departures from the usual style of travel writing that may be charged against me, for I think I have seen with impartial eyes, and I am sure I have written at least honestly, whether wisely or not. He begins by setting out an identity. I'm not like those other writers. I'm going to give you something you've never seen before. And secondly, he starts the book by separating himself from other travelers who claim to be writers but are not. So he describes how they started on their trip across the Atlantic, and every night all the people on the boat started writing a journal. Maybe you've been on a trip, you started writing a journal, and you never finished it. After prayers in the main dining hall, they took the semblance of a writing school. Behind the long dining tables on either side of the saloon, some 20 or 30 gentlemen and ladies sat them down under swaying lamps and for 2 or 3 hours wrote diligently in their journals on this boat. Alas, that journals so voluminously begun should come to be so lame and impotent a conclusion as most of them did. I doubt if there is a single pilgrim of all that host but can show even 100 fair pages of journal concerning the first 20 days voyaging in the Quaker City, and I'm morally certain that not 10 of the party can show 20 pages of journal for the succeeding 20,000 miles of voyaging. You see what he's doing? First, he's saying, I'm not like other writers, and secondly, he's saying, I'm not like other travelers because I'm a real writer. He's affirming an identity. So that's one of his themes. The second theme is America is different from Europe, and I'm going to show you why. This is where he had spent time in Lake Tahoe around Nevada, Emperor of France, Napoleon III, Versailles Palace, images of France. So he describes how different it is in Europe. Once I crossed the plains and deserts and mountains of the West in a stagecoach from the Missouri line to California, 2,000 miles of ceaseless rush and rattle and clatter. It was worth a lifetime of toiling to scan the blue distances of a world that knew no lords but us, to cleave the wind with uncovered head. But I forgot. I am in elegant France now and not scurrying through the great South Pass and the Wind River Mountains among antelopes and buffaloes in France. In France, all is clockwork. All is order. They make no mistakes. Every third man wears a uniform, whether it be a marshal of the empire or a brakeman. You see, he's affirming American freedom against the rigidity of Europe. He's also affirming the kind of aw-shucks American style. He doesn't buy into all that deference to European culture. This is Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, which he goes to see in Milan. This image on the right is Samuel F.B. Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, who aspired to be a painter and painted an image of the Louvre. So Twain, unlike Margaret Fuller and every other writer, he says, I've seen this stuff. It's not that big a deal. We've seen pictures of martyrs enough and saints enough to regenerate the world. I ought not to confess it, but still, since one has no opportunity in America to acquire critical judgment in art, I may therefore as well acknowledge with such apologies as may be due that to me it seemed that when I had seen one of these martyrs, I had seen them all. Not very referential there. They all have a marked family resemblance to each other, and they dress alike in coarse monkish robes and sandals. Rather than say, oh my God, it was amazing, I was so moved. He just, man, I've seen one, seen them all. Not very respectful. Or here he goes to Rome, and everyone's saying, oh, this is so amazing, and there's all this great history here, all these amazing buildings. He says, Rome? What is it that confers the noblest delight? Discovery. To be the first, that is the idea, to do something, say something, see something before anybody else. What is there in Rome for me to see that others have not seen before me? What is there for me to touch that others have not touched? What can I discover? Nothing, nothing whatsoever. Rome, been there, done that. I'm going to do something new. I'm Mark Twain. There's only one area where Twain says Europe is advanced of America. And I want to mention this because it has to do with race, and he's going to write about race in Huckleberry Finn. He talks about guides. He's always making fun of the guides. But there's one guide who's an African American who's now living in Venice. The guide I have spoken of is the only one we have had yet who knew anything. He was born in South Carolina of slave parents. He has grown up here. He is well educated. He reads, writes, and speaks English, Italian, Spanish, and French with perfect facilities. Negroes are deemed as good as white people in Venice, and so this man feels no desire to go back to his native land. His judgment is correct. You see, this is the one place where Twain says, America has a problem that Europe doesn't have, at least not in the same way. This is an image of Frederick Douglass, but it captures the image of the African American. And then there is the other theme. All of the people on this trip are on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And Twain is totally disrespectful of churches, of relics. He makes fun of the wealth of the church. He goes to the cathedral in Milan, and all he can talk about is how they have all this gold and silver when people outside are starving to death. So this is what he says about relics. You know how you go in a cathedral and they show you these relics? Isn't this relic matter a little overdone? We find a piece of the true cross in every church we go into, and some of the nails that held it together. I think we've seen as much as a keg of these nails. Then there is the crown of thorns. They have a part of one in Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, part of one also in Notre Dame. And as for the bones of Saint Denis, I feel certain that we have seen enough of them to duplicate him if necessary. He's not very respectful of these relics. He's making fun of this stuff, right? And finally, he has this anxiety about fame, about the transience of human life. He goes to Pompeii and talks about the transience of life. He goes to Egypt, and he says, we see in these places the unsubstantial, unlasting character of fame. You see, he wants to be famous to overcome death. Men lived long lives in the olden time and struggled feverishly through them, toiling like slaves in oratory, in generalship, or in literature, and then laid them down and died, happy in the possession of an enduring history and a deathless name. Well, 20 little centuries flutter away, and what is left of these things? A crazy inscription on a block of stone, which snuffy antiquaries bother over and make nothing out of but a bare name. You see, fame is fleeting, and he has hoped to be a writer. He wants to challenge mortality. And he goes to, just like David Dorr, he goes to Egypt. He looks at these monuments, the same ones that Dorr saw, and he's fascinated by the Sphinx, which is 5,000 years old. The bland, impassible Sphinx looks out from her throne on the sands as placidly and pensively as she had looked a full 50 lagging centuries ago. Those who made the Sphinx knew all which we know now, perchance, and more. They walked in the broad highway of civilization in the gray dawn of creation, ages and ages before we were born, and they left the impress of exalted, cultivated mind upon the eternal front of the Sphinx. Isn't this reassuring when you think about all our problems right now? You should take a look at the Sphinx. 5,000 years come and go. Human problems, as Twain points out, disappear. And so he ends his book by saying this: travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. He asserts his identity as a writer, as a traveler, as a knowledgeable person. So he came back and he married Olivia Langdon, the sister of his fellow traveler. He had a few years of happiness in the 1870s and early 1880s. He had 4 children, 1 son and 3 daughters. Here are his 3 daughters. He wrote his greatest novels, things like Tom Sawyer and especially Huckleberry Finn in 1885. And yet, even at this time, problems came. His son died at age 18 months, and he felt terrible guilt about the death of his son. And then his daughter Susie died when she was only 24 in 1896. Another tragedy. And then his wife Livy, he always called her Livy, died when she was only 59 in 1904. So he knew the struggle of sadness. He also lost hundreds of thousands of dollars by investing in a machine, a printing machine that failed. So he had to make money by giving lectures, by going around the world and making money to pay off his debts. This was his response to grief. And yet there are so many ways in which Mark Twain's travels and his travel writing expressed a new kind of identity, not only for himself, what we might call a new personal identity, but a new kind of American identity. The very identity of the quintessential American writer was framed through the experience of leaving America. And he found his voice on that great trip. And in fact, he could never have written Huckleberry Finn, a great travel novel down the Mississippi, without what he learned from his travels. So I want to turn now more quickly to David Sedaris and make a few points about him. He was born in 1956. His life as a writer, a traveler, a lecturer, a humorist builds on Twain's example. Sedaris was born on December 26, 1956 in Johnson City, New York. His family was part of the Greek Orthodox Church. But as a young boy, his family brought him to Raleigh, North Carolina. So he grew up in Raleigh, just like Twain, very far from the centers of literary culture. Nothing against Raleigh, but it's not New York City. His father worked for IBM, and he was part of that great migration to Wake County. He had also, like Twain, he had here 5 brothers and sisters. Well, he actually had 4 sisters and 1 brother. He also lost a sister, Tiffany, who later committed suicide very tragically a few years ago. And his other sister, Amy Sedaris, became an actress and a very popular comedian. So, interesting story. He went to Sanderson High School in Raleigh. This is a little shout out to North Carolina, ladies and gentlemen. I want to show you, if you go to high school in Raleigh, you too can become a traveling writer. But he dropped out of college. He got into drugs. He went wandering across the country, working on odd jobs. He went all the way to California, hitchhiking. He came back to Raleigh. He even lived a little while in Chapel Hill and worked at the Carolina Coffee Shop. I just want to give that little shout out also, something Mark Twain never did. He eventually went to Chicago and the Art Institute, graduated as an undergraduate and lived in Chicago for a number of years and began writing what he called realish diaries. Not exactly realistic, but telling stories and narrating these on local radio shows. He met a man named Ira Glass, who produces This American Life on NPR, and Ira became his supporter. I should mention I met David Sedaris last year. He came to Raleigh to give a talk, and I went to see him, and I bought his diary, Theft by Finding, and I just have to throw this in. He signed my book, "To Lloyd, I wish you were my history teacher." Mark Twain never gave me a copy of his book, but I just have to throw this out there. But like Mark Twain, David Sedaris used writing and travel to construct an identity. He moved to New York in 1990, And just like Mark Twain had a breakthrough story, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, he had the Santaland Diaries. I don't know if you've ever heard this. It's on NPR. He tells the story of how he got a job as an elf at Macy's department store for Christmas, and it's the most hilarious story of he had to wear a little elf costume. And he tells this story on NPR, and it makes him famous a little like a jumping frog of Calaveras County. And he started being a public speaker, telling stories. And he eventually moved to France. Oh, I should mention he met this man, Hugh Hamrick, because David Sedaris came out as a gay man, and then he fell in love with Hugh, and here they are actually in a house that Hugh owns in Normandy, and here they are cooking. But I want to talk about his relation to travel, and his most relevant book here, which is called Me Talk Pretty One Day, which came out in 2000. It's a book that grows out of his extended stay in France between 1998 and 2002. He now lives in southern England, although he comes back to the States often on speaking tours. And this is a story about finding your voice. Remember I said Mark Twain found his voice by traveling, and so did David Sedaris. He had to learn how to speak proudly and pretty in his own voice. But how to do that? He wrote this book about basically traveling from Raleigh to Paris. And it begins with a story of when he's a boy at school in Raleigh, and his teacher sends him to, and his parents send him to a speech therapy class because he has a lisp. He can't pronounce S. And this begins to shape his identity. He can't speak. He can't speak properly. He says one day, this is describing his experience, I started keeping watch over the speech therapy door, taking note of who came and went. Had I seen one popular student leaving the office, I could have believed my mother and viewed my lisp as the sort of thing that might have happened to anyone. Unfortunately, I saw no popular students. Obviously, there was some connection between a sibilant S and a complete lack of interest in the state versus Carolina issue. That's the other thing. His teacher said, are you for state or for Carolina? And he said, I don't know. How do you fit in North Carolina? So he says there was the lisp, of course, but more troubling was my voice itself. With its excitable tone and high girlish pitch, I'd hear myself ordering lunch in the cafeteria, and the sound would turn my stomach. How could anyone stand to listen to me? Me Talk Pretty One Day is the story of a man finding his voice. So he tells the story about how he moves to France. He tries to learn French. He studies French in a language school, the Alliance Française. Many of you may have gone there. And he lived in this house part of the year out in Normandy and studied French. And then he tells how hard it is to speak another language. For me, France was never a specific premeditated destination. I wound up in Normandy the way my mother wound up in North Carolina. You meet a guy, relinquish a little bit of control. The next thing you know, you're living and you're eating a different part of the pig. And so he says, I went to France knowing only the word for bottleneck. Not a very useful word, but he knew it. I said bottleneck at the airport, bottleneck on the train to Normandy, and bottleneck when presented with the pile of stone that was Hugh's house in the country. I seemed to have reached my mid-30s only to be known as the guy who says bottleneck. And then he says, eventually I began speaking, I went from speaking like an evil baby to speaking like a hillbilly. Is them the thoughts of the cows, I asked the butcher, pointing to the calves' brains. You know, they eat calves' brains in France. Displayed in the front window, I want me some lamb chops with handles on them. Language, voice, he can't get it. It's beyond his reach. And then he tells one more story. I just have to tell this one, about how difficult it is to communicate between cultures. He tells about being at the Alliance Française and trying to understand different cultures. And there's a discussion about Easter bunnies and chocolate bells. This is one of the great scenes in the book, Me Talk Pretty One Day. So the teacher asks a question about Easter. Who brings the chocolate? The teacher asked. I knew the word, so I raised my hand saying, the rabbit of Easter, he bring of the chocolate. A rabbit? Well, sure, I said. He come in the night when one sleep on a bed with a hand, he have a basket and foods. The teacher sighed and shook her head. As far as she was concerned, I had just explained everything that was wrong with my country. No, no, she said. Here in France, the chocolate is brought by a big bell that flies in from Rome. I called for time out. But how do the bell know where you live? Well, she said, how does a rabbit? It was a decent point. But at least a rabbit has eyes. That's a start. Rabbits move from place to place while most bells can only go back and forth, and they can't even do that on their own power. On top of that, the Easter Bunny has character. He's someone you'd like to meet and shake hands with. A bell has all the personality of a cast iron skillet. You see, I love this story. It's sort of like people can't communicate across the barrier of language. And he says in his class he had to represent all of America, because when you're in another country, you can't escape your identity. Whenever my government refuses to sign a treaty or decides to throw its weight around in NATO, I became not an American citizen, but rather America itself. During Bill Clinton's impeachment hearings, my French teacher would often single me out, saying, "You Americans, you're all such Puritans." Citizens of Europe and Asia, my fellow class members, would agree with her, while I'd wonder, are we? You see, in a foreign country, you come face to face with an identity you cannot escape. He didn't think of himself as being so American, but his language, his identity, defined him as American. So there's so much more that we could actually look at with Sedaris as well as Twain, but I want to conclude by simply noting that Sedaris continues exploring the kind of challenges that Twain faced on his great journey. How do you define the meaning of America? How do you speak clearly, even as the writer feels separated from aspects of American culture, feeling both American and not American? And doing this kind of travel changes the way you look at yourself, because travel redefines selfhood. And during this kind of experience, you redefine who you are. This, by the way, Mark Twain got an honorary degree at Oxford. He never went to college. He loved having a cap and gown. There he is. So what does travel teach us? I want to come back to my overall thesis that when you go somewhere, it looks different from how you imagined it to be, how it differs from reading about it in books. And the travels of Twain and Sedaris offer examples of how travel and travel writing and humor have helped to define the meaning of both personal and collective American identities. Anyone who has traveled extensively in foreign countries has had the disorienting experience of facing the limits of your own language, of feeling like a little kid because you can't explain who you are, even as you have a deeper understanding of your own selfhood. So I want to suggest that this is why travel transforms people, if you keep at it long enough. And I'm giving us a pep talk tonight. When the pandemic ends, hit the road. Get out there again. And when you eventually begin traveling, I hope you'll prepare by reading some of the great travel narratives. I hope you'll read about journeys. I even hope you'll read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, because I don't think Twain could have written the great American novel about a journey on the Mississippi River if he had not made his own previous journeys to California, to Hawaii, to Europe, to Palestine, to Egypt, to all of the places where he came to understand what it meant to be American. And David Sedaris could not have told about his journey to a French language school without his own long trip from a Raleigh high school to California, to Chicago, to New York, and finally to Paris. So this is why the old cliche about human lives still carries a lot of truth. Life is a journey, not a destination. And we're all still following in the footsteps of Margaret Fuller and David Dorr and Mark Twain and all the other 19th century travelers who made the long trip before any of us ever even set out on our own voyages which we still don't know exactly where we're headed. Okay, bon voyage, and that's the end of my trip. I may have gone a little long, so if people need to leave, I understand, but if we have any questions, I'm happy to respond. If you're at home, you can go get yourself a cold drink. This is the moment you've been waiting for. Maybe you've already done it. Any questions?
All right, we've got a question to start off here. Was there any place that Twain actually did like or was impressed with during his travels abroad?
Is there any place Twain actually liked that he traveled to?
Yes.
You know, I think although he complained bitterly about the Egyptian tour guides and people always asking for tips and ripping him off, I think he was fascinated by Egypt. I've read that quote about the Sphinx. There was something about the grandeur of the pyramids and the Sphinx that humbled him, and although he was kind of a smart aleck all the time, you notice from that quote, he said, I stand here bedazzled by the antiquity of this place. For 5,000 years, human beings have been crossing this place. So I think he was fascinated by it. And there were other things that interested him, but he was not at all respectful of cathedrals and museums and historic sites. He made fun of most of them. And religious shrines, he had no use for whatsoever.
All right. Another question here about language. So you talked about David Sedaris going to great lengths to try to learn French. Was Twain at all invested in learning foreign languages? And if so, how did that fit into his understanding of what it meant to be an American?
Sedaris' experience? Or
Oh, I apologize, Twain.
Twain, as far as I know, he did not learn other languages. He makes fun of himself for how poorly he speaks French. He goes to Paris, for example, and makes a fool of himself trying to speak French. I actually think Twain would have gotten a lot more out of his trip if he knew another language. There's a famous expression by Goethe, Johann Goethe, the great German poet, who said, anyone who does not speak another language cannot fully know his own language. And I think it's just like anyone who's not been into another cultural sphere cannot fully understand your own culture. This is why if I could give a little shout out to all those people who teach foreign languages are like a trip into a different culture, and that was one of Twain's limits. Of course, you could say he was pretty good in English. We can't be perfect. He could speak a lot of dialects, but he never learned French or Italian or the other languages.
Okay.
Sedaris, on the other hand, spent years trying to learn French, but he always said he had problems getting his point across, as you can see.
So this is connected in that I think it's about limits. So I'm struck by, with both of these examples, how much of the action takes place in the in-between times. Takes place on the steamboat or on the raft or on the, in the classroom in these laborious lessons for French. And so I guess I would just love to hear you reflect a little bit about that, especially at this moment when travel seems to be speeding up so much.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There is something important about the in-between spaces. Remember I read Alain de Botton describing the journey itself. He describes being on an airplane, being on a train, being on a boat. I've never taken a boat to Europe. Has anybody here taken a boat to Europe? We do, ladies and gentlemen, out there in Zoom land, we have people in this room who've been on a long boat trip. And there's something different about a journey over days in a boat. And that's part of what Twain describes. It took 3 weeks to get across to the Mediterranean. And I do think that changes the meaning of space and time. Most of us don't have that experience now. Imagine when we could really travel. We have the instantaneous experience of getting on a plane in Raleigh and being in Paris the next morning. I think the transition of a long journey changes the meaning of travel. It's also true that it's the in-between spaces where you reflect on the meaning of your travel. on the meaning of trying to speak a language. Because when you're actually at the restaurant ordering food or trying to buy something in a shop, you're not reflecting, you're just struggling. But both Twain and Sedaris go home and they write about it. And the process of writing is where it becomes an identity-shaping reflection. So my advice also, when you travel again, try to write some letters. And you know, Twain makes fun of people writing journals. All of us have had this idea, I'm going to write a journal, and then you don't do it. But if you do, it is the act of writing that transforms the experience.
Thank you for that. All right, we have one last question here. Are there any comparable European authors to these men who wrote about America?
Oh, yes, or Europeans who wrote about America. There have been many, many travelers. I guess that, you know, the most famous are people like Alexis de Tocqueville, who came and traveled all around America. There were travelers in the late 18th century. There were the people like Chateaubriand, a French writer, came to America and wrote about that in the late 1800s. There was another writer, Brissot. There have been many, many writers who've written about America. More recently, there have been a number of travel narratives about America. Yeah, I mean, there's a travel writing industry in Europe writing about America as there is in America writing about Europe. Charles Dickens wrote a famous account of traveling to America in the 1840s. Francis Trollope wrote a famous travel book about America in the 1820s. There were many famous European writers who staked out their writing identity in part by writing about America. Tocqueville's probably the best known. But.
So if we want to start travel book groups, we have ample material to draw from.
You can always find another travel book. I think I would recommend that book. Alain de Botton's The Art of Travel is an interesting short book to begin reading as a way of reflecting on what travel means, and then people can bring their own experiences to the table. So if you're in a book group, you might read something about the art of travel or about a travel narrative. And I personally love Mark Twain's book. I love many of the modern travel books. And there are many writers who wrote about France, for example. Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast about the meaning of Paris in the 1920s, for example. So there are many, many things you can read.
Wonderful. Well, you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of great reading suggestions, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and let me just say that being here with Bill Bretman in this room makes me feel like I'm on a journey, because whenever I'm with Bill, he takes me to a different place in my head. He's read so many books and seen so many films. He's like a traveler, a time traveler. So I'm happy to be giving the Bill Bretman lecture on travel and identity, because he's taken people on a lot of journeys. He's a tour guide to the experience of life. Mr. Bill Bretman, thank you for all you've done. And let me thank Charlotte and all the people here for this wonderful series you have at Wayne Community College. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody.